Good morning, everyone. This morning we're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 2. If you haven't picked up on the theme or noticed from the title, this week we've been talking about what it means to be an exile. And kind of basing this off of a video that we've looked at called The Way of the Exile by the Bible Project. But a lot of times when you look in the Old Testament, there's a lot of themes and a lot of big pictures that you kind of have to put together to understand things. And I think Clark's devotional from yesterday kind of started to help put things more in as precise and direct as they can be. But I think 1 Peter 2 really wraps it up. And this theme of the exile is really nowhere else in the New Testament more clear than it is in 1 Peter. Peter actually starts off the letter by referring to the people that he's writing to as saying the elect exiles. But this morning I want to start by looking in 1 Peter 2 chapter 2 verse 11. Peter says this by the inspiration of God, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles." This idea, sojourners and exiles, Clark talked about a little bit with the idea of Daniel, but it's essentially that they are removed from the land. That's part of it, but also you think in terms of they're removed from power. They are no longer their own autonomous government, but instead, that was a big deal for them. The fact that they didn't have, for example, the temple that they could claim, as they often did, as hey, look, this shows God's allegiance to us. They didn't have the temple. They didn't have the rule of government. They didn't have all these things, and instead they found themselves living in Babylon, this place that was, in a lot of ways, not at all in line with what God was all about, what God was teaching them to be as His people. So Peter and several of the New Testament writers pick up this theme and talk to us in terms of being these sojourners and exiles. Now, is this because Christians aren't in government? There's not a Christian president? No, that's not at all what's happening here. And in fact, what he's trying to say is that even if you have Christians in power, we're not really going to be at home, right? That idea of sojourner, that you're away from your home, much like they were in the exile. You're not really going to be home until you're home with God. And this idea of exile, you're not really going to be where you belong until you're back with God. And this is what Peter regularly sprinkles in throughout this letter, is that we need to think in terms of ourselves as being in exile, being apart from our home, being away from where we truly, really belong. So this passage starts off by laying that out. He says, "I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable." Now, he's picking up this idea once again, Gentiles. The idea that the church is this new Israel. Before, Israel was, and a lot of people thought in terms of a place or a kingdom, and now that they're exiles, God makes this really clear. You're still my chosen people. And here we see, even though we're no longer a kingdom, even though we're no longer a land, we're now the church, which in itself is kind of hard to explain. We are still God's chosen people, this new Israel. And everyone that's outside of this, all the unbelievers, whether they are living in the Middle East or whether they're living in Europe or America or wherever, unbelievers he's referring to as Gentiles, being those outside of God's chosen people. God has chosen them, but they haven't yet come to that, right? We use this terminology. But he says, keep your conduct honorable. Why? But because that's, just the thing to do? No, he gives a clear reason. So that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. He says, look, in no other letter is this more clear. Christians were being persecuted. They were not seen as going with the flow of things. They were seen as out there, as different. And just that difference alone, a lot of times, made people not like them and see them as a challenge to whatever it was that was going on. Now, this is all great. Most of this we all get. Other than the exile theme, this is stuff we usually talk about within church. But then verse 13. "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by them to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good." Which obviously, you hear that and you think, yeah, when does the government do that? Do they really get that right all the time? No, they do not get that right all the time. And I don't want you to think that somehow in America this is more true than what Peter was originally writing to. Think about the mass killings of Christians sheerly because they were Christians that was going on around this time. This is the context of that original statement. Not that we expect them to always get it right. Like Clark talked about with Daniel. Daniel interprets the dream. Then what does he do? He's like, hey, here's this idol. You think Daniel was like, yes, more idols in Babylon. That's what we need. No, not at all. But yet Daniel still sought out the well-being of Babylon. And he still stood up for his values and what he knew to be right. And if there ever was a push come to shove, like his story of the lion's den and like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire, they stood up for what they knew was right. And I guarantee Daniel was not just going with the flow every time he had a say in policy. And I guarantee they knew exactly where he stood. How else did he make the enemies that he did that were looking for a way to trip him up? Because when he said something, it didn't fit with whatever the political whims of that time were. He stood out. He was different. But even though we are called to be subject, we're called to honor. Let's go on here. Verse 15, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. This is the one where I feel like we really, as the church, as New Israel, as exiles, we need to look at ourselves and say, is our deeds putting to silence this ignorance that people may be throwing us? That's the same thing they were going through. When people said, these Christians, they're bad. These Jews, they're bad. When they said, they probably say all this stuff, and like Daniel's situation, people can start to believe that. But then you see the good deeds that they do, and there really is no argument to be had. Anyone that truly knows a Christian should be able to say, hey, you may claim that they're bigots, that they don't love people, but I know for a fact that they do. That's the way we should live. We should live in such a way that if people know us, it puts to silence any argument that people try to make about Christians. And then the question is, are we doing that? And I think, a lot of what we wanted to do with this week is to show us that if we're not careful, we can fall into the same traps that everybody else does. We can fall into the same traps of, living an outward life that doesn't match the inward one. We can fall into traps of thinking that government is the solution, that we need to find a way to get more influence and just, if the government would get in line with God's way. No, that's not at all what He wants. That's not at all what God ever expected from us. And much like Daniel, he never wanted more power. He wasn't necessarily seeking out to be like the king of Babylon. In fact, he was kind of thrust into the position that he was in. But because of his faithfulness, and because of his faithfulness to God and to seeing the well-beings of the Babylonians, that's why he got to where he was. But then let's go on. Verse 16, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Do we use our freedom to cover up, the bad that we have inside? Do we use our freedom to cover up, political malice or any kind of ill intent that we have inside of us? Or do we use that freedom as servants of God, which we know to be a servant of God means to be a servant of people as well? And then he wraps this up to make it as clear as possible. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And yet that last little part there, much like verse 14 from earlier, it's like, how in the world can I honor that leader? We all have that leader that we're like, there is just no way that I could honor them, not just tolerate them, not just be okay that they're in the position that they're in, honor them. Man, look at both sides of this right now, what we see. Both sides honor the ones they like and then tell you all the bad stuff about what's wrong with the other side. that just shows you that we're not acting at all how Christians are supposed to be acting in this situation. If we can't show honor to someone that we know, I mean, think about it. The examples here that Peter is talking to the people, their example of who they're thinking of when they think of the emperor, or even Daniel's example of a Babylonian king. I mean, that is the archetype for the bad people in the Bible is Babylon. And yet this is the context in which he says to honor these people. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not even saying that, I'm not saying that we all should be perfectly doing that. I'm just saying realize we are called to do that. And if we can't figure out how to do that, or worse yet, if we just think, that doesn't, we explain it away like we do a lot of different other things, then we're not truly trying to live the examples that we see in Scripture. Think about Jesus. He very well knew how to flirt that line between showing honor to those in authority, but also challenging them to think, challenging them to see that there's something bigger than them, challenging their power to say, much like Jesus said to Pilate, you would have no authority if it wasn't given to you from above. Are we comfortable saying those sort of things today? Even as the world is burning, even as countries are being torn apart by their leaders, could we comfortably say, those kind of statements? But yet, that's where we are. That for good or for bad, we know there's something greater. There's a kingdom greater. There's a king greater than the one that whatever land you're in at this point in time. And this is the context by which we're called to be subject to every human authority and to honor everyone, including honoring the emperor. Now, that shouldn't be used as a tool to beat into submission. Maybe you're a fan of whoever the president is right now. This is not a tool to use to beat everybody else into submission, because guess what? Pretty soon the time's going to come when you're not going to agree with whoever the president is that time. This is a difficult thing to do, but nonetheless, this is something that we are called to do. We're called to live in a society that we know is not in line with God's will. Across the board, there's no society that we're like, yeah, that one got it right. In fact, the one that God tried to get right, people messed it up, right? God's way may have been perfect, but people have a tendency to mess things up. There is no society, there's no nation, there's no kingdom that's got it all right. And in that context is where we're called to honor them. We still stand up for our values, but we do so in a way where we don't completely just try to uphold or uprise and overthrow and all these sort of things, but instead we're called to honor and to live subversively, yes, but still honor in how we do that. I know it's difficult. I know it's challenging. I'm not saying that I've got all the practical ways of how that works out. I just want to remind us that this is what we're taught about how to live in a time where government and officials and leaders just truly make a mess of everything. And we don't agree with it. Guess what? That's not new. But our call to honor them and to live in this way has been the same throughout all of God's Scripture and really of all time. I don't expect that to answer everything, but hopefully we can talk about this more, and hopefully you wrestle with this more, and we get more in line with where a Christian should be through all this difficult time. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully this week has been maybe eye-opening and challenging. Hopefully maybe it's even been a little bit encouraging to know that it's not on you to fix all of these problems. It's not on you to make America what it was supposed to be. America could die tomorrow, and us as Christians know that we have something better to look forward to, right? Hopefully this is encouraging to you and challenging. If you want to know every time one of these devotionals come out, subscribe to us, click the bell. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to seeing you in person.